FDI project to Asia decreased in size from 65 to 47 million between 2018 and 2019. Next slide, please. From a sector perspective, Asia's manufacturing and services suffered losses in 2019, with a fall in total inward FDI of 44% for manufacturing and 30% for services. And this is explained basically by the effect on greenfield investment in manufacturing. In contrast, FDI in the primary sector increased by 32%. Next slide, please. Estimations on job losses from FDI investments and divestments suggest that job creation for greenfield investment also declined in 2019 due to the lower number of greenfield projects in Asia. And we see that this is the trend with employment linked to intra-regional investment declining by 35%, especially in Singapore, PRC China, and Hong Kong. Next slide, please. Now, let's take a look at what we see so far in 2020. And these are some of the early estimates we have been collected and at ADB, but other institutions have their own estimates. So please, next slide. A comparison with previous years of inward investment in Asia during the first quarter, and more precisely from January to May, shows that the region has experienced a contraction in external investment. Inward FDI for greenfield projects dropped by 35%, with more noticeable effects in East Asia and Central Asia, which we have on the right side. The number of greenfield projects also collapsed by 30% compared to the previous year. But this is not an exception, and Asia is certainly not an exception in this case. All regions globally are expected to see negative FDI growth rates in 2020, as we will see in the presentation from our colleagues from UNCTAD. Next slide, please. We see a similar pattern with the comparison of mergers and acquisitions, both globally on the left side and for Asia, where we see again a decline globally on for M&A of 51% between the first quarter and the last quarter of 2019 and 2020, and a 35% decline for the Asian region. Next slide, please. In terms of Asia's outward investment, which is the other side of the coin, what we see is, again, a slowing down with respect to previous years. And this is, again, comparing first quarters of outward investment for greenfield and M&A. So we see that the trend is decreasing also for outward investments from Asian countries to the rest of the world. Next slide, please. So what are the policies that countries are taking today to respond to this crisis? Asian countries have taken measures to mitigate effects on FDI. They include measures on investment facilitation, services on investment promotion agencies, as we will see today on the case on Indonesia, and also incentives for investment. Different types of incentives have been used during the crisis, including the rapid development of medical equipment, the conversion of production lines, and tariff waivers for FDI-related activities. At the international level, the policy measures have included pledges on global initiatives, particularly the G20, and the resort of international investment agreements. This is another issue that we will cover during the panel discussion. So far, the pace of bilateral investment treaties has slowed down due to the crisis. However, we might see an increase in the provisions and the disputes between investors and states, and that's some of the issues that we hope to discuss more at length during this seminar. Looking forward, the pandemic is likely to have a lasting effect on the investment landscape for developing Asia, and FDI contribution will be instrumental beyond financing for the economic recovery. Let me stop here the introduction to the topic so we can continue with the rest of the session. Thank you, and over to you, Yongbu.
Thank you, Rolando. Thank you very much for giving us a brief overview of how the Asia's FDI is faring at the moment, and in terms of the greenfield investment versus M&A, also what could be policy challenge that the policymakers in the region are facing at the moment. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists first to you. First, Dr. Maria Borga is the Deputy Division Chief in the Balance of Payments Division of the International Monetary Fund. Prior to joining the IMF in June 2020, she was a senior statistician in the investment division of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. And there she oversaw the collection and the dissemination of FDI statistics by the OECD. And her research includes integrating FDI statistics into the OECD Trade and Value Added, the TIVA database, and harmonizing and linking FDI statistics with the statistics on the operations of multinational enterprises. Our next speaker, Dr. Amelia Santos Polino, is Chief of the Investment Research Section at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, in Geneva, Switzerland. Previously, she was senior economist at UNCTAD Division for Africa, least developed countries and special programs, working on trade and poverty, regional integration, the SDG agenda, as well as the vulnerability profiles of the least developed countries. So before joining the UNCTAD, she was a research fellow and project director in the United Nations Universities of the World Institute for Development Economics Research. Our next speaker, Mr. Alma Karma, is director of the Promotion Development for the Indonesia Investment Coordinating Board, Indonesian government agency which focuses on managing investment into Indonesia. He has spent over 23 years working in this institution with various job experiences over the periods of his tenure there. And he graduated from the Indonesian Institute of Technology, majoring in the mechanical engineering, and a master in the engineering management from the George Washington University of USA. And the last but not least, Dr. Julian Chase is a professor at the City University of Hong Kong School of Law. He's an award-winning scholar and a globally recognized authority on the intersection between international economic law, trade, investment, tax, international dispute resolution, and the transnational law of globalization. His scholarship, which includes a dozen books and over 60 articles and book chapters, has been cited by international courts, tribunals, as well as the US courts. With that, I would like to ask each panelist to spend for around 5 to 6 minutes for the initial round of their intervention. Unfortunately, our first speaker, Maria Borga, could not join us virtually because of the time difference between Manila and the DC. Actually, it's now 1:15 a.m. in DC. So instead, she has kindly provided us with a short video clip pre-recorded this morning. So we're gonna show her video clip to you first. Then we are going to move on to the next speaker, Miss Amelia. So Mara, is the video clip ready?
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you, but unfortunately the timing didn't work out. So I'm Maria Borga. I'm now at the Balance of Payments Division at the IMF, but this is actually work that I did in my previous position at the OECD, where I headed up the team on FDI statistics. Next slide, please. And so just to give an idea of what was going on with FDI flows really at the time the pandemic hit, this chart shows the last 20 years of global FDI flows, and the line shows the value in billions of USD, and then the bars show this as a share of global GDP. And so some context for seeing how large those flows were. And so what we can see is that in 2018 and 2019, FDI flows were at their lowest level actually as a share of GDP since 2010. And so this means that global FDI flows were really struggling in the past few years. And this is quite different than the situation was when the global financial crisis hit. So if we look back to 2007, we see that FDI had really been booming at the time that the global financial crisis started. And so we're in a quite different position at the time the pandemic hit. And the OECD actually just collected the first quarter 2020 data from a large number of countries on FDI, and they've made their first estimates of global FDI for the first quarter of 2020. And we see that FDI flows have fallen considerably from the fourth quarter of 2019. They're down by 48%. And if you look at the year-over-year change, what we see is that Q1 of 2020 is only about half of where we were in Q1 of 2019. So we're already seeing a very large impact on FDI from the COVID-19 outbreak. Next slide, please. So there are also some other ways that this crisis looks different than the global financial crisis. And the first is really in how severe and how sudden the drop in economic activity has been. So if you look at the chart, and this is from the World Economic Outlook from the IMF, and so 2020 are projections, although by this point we had for most countries the first quarter of 2020 in. But what we can see is that it's been a much more sudden drop than in 2007. So really things started down in 2007 and didn't hit bottom until 2009. Here between 2019 and 2020, there's just a very big drop. And the other thing is to notice is that while the advanced economies were at about the same level of growth as they were in 2019 as they were at the time of the financial crisis in 2007, for the emerging and developing economies, they were all already growing more slowly than they were back in 2007. So again, we were in a sort of slower growth phase in terms of GDP growth and FDI in 2019 than in 2007. Now that we've also seen some sectors being hit very, very hard. Of course, in any recession, some sectors are hit more than others, but in this case, we've had really severe impacts in some sectors like travel and tourism, commodities, in particular energy. There was a significant drop in energy prices, some parts of manufacturing, and a lot of consumer discretionary spending. On the other hand, some sectors have done well. So you see things like communications, IT, some medical equipment or pharmaceuticals have done well. And another thing that I think is particularly relevant for FDI was that in 2019, we had record levels of corporate debt. So if you looked at the corporate bonds for non-financial corporations, they were at an all-time high at the end of 2019. And in addition, some of that credit was at a lower overall quality. It had some higher payback requirements. And this is all from an OECD report. And so what we know is that this can really constrain the ability of firms to support their affiliates with financing in terms of.
Okay, so it has been quite useful, for Maria to provide us with some big picture of how the global FDI flows are faring during the pandemic. And also she has touched upon the issue of how much is severe this time around compared to the global financial crisis back in 2008 and 9. And also she has flagged some silver lining. For example, there are still some sustaining FDI flows into the sectors such as the healthcare and the telecommunications and the ICT sectors. So those kind of issues we can also discuss in the following panel session. So with that, I'd like to ask Ms. Amelia to give us her short presentation. Perhaps given that Maria has covered the global picture, perhaps you can focus more on the stories for the developing Asia. You have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you to ADB and colleagues for inviting me to participate. My presentation will be mostly based on the findings of the World Investment Report 2020. I will not go into much detail into trends because already Rolando and Maria set out the stage very nicely. In addition to discussing some trends for Asia, we'll also bring out some of our findings from our analytical chapter that is on the future of international production and also how how the pandemic sort of brought pre-existing trends to what we call boiling points, trends in terms of global governance, sustainability, and the impact of the new industrial revolution. So next slide, please. Next, please. Hello? Okay, no, sorry, the previous one, the second slide. Okay, thank you. So, I mean, as Rolando already discussed, and Maria, the COVID crisis had hit the global FDI landscape and has led to a dramatic fall in FDI. Here we show what was the recent trend and also our projections. So we saw that the impact will be to have, I mean, the impact on FDI was a decrease of around 40% globally. And I mean, this will take, the recovery will take at least 2 years to at least go back to pre-existing trend. And basically hopefully starting in 2022, investment flows will slowly improve, led by hopefully the restructuring of global value chain for resilience and replenishment of capital stock and the recovery of the global economy. In general, the outlook is highly uncertain, and as we know, prospect will depend on the duration of the crisis and the pandemic. Next, please. Okay, so basically, looking at the regional trends, in general, the impact will be in the region of minus 30% to 55%, with developing Asia, the flows to developing Asia being expected to decrease between 30 and 45%. I mean, developing economies are hit the hardest because reasons that have been discussed globally already, and mostly because these economies, developing economies, Asia included, rely more on investment in global value chain intensive industries, and also in other regions like Africa and Latin America, and also some least developed countries in Asia, the impact on extractive industries through oil prices have been very important. So Asia, despite being more advanced in some areas in terms of regional integration and in terms of global value chains than other developing regions, still this interconnection is what makes the impact being magnified in terms of investment flows. I mean, as I said, on average, FDI is expected to fall between 30 to 45% this year. And as we know, the lockdown measures in Asia have led to temporary factory and business closures, depressing the investment environment. Supply chain disruptions, as we have seen in the press and also early papers that have been published, have led to what we seen like liquidity challenges in multinational enterprises, and not only in Asia but also in other developing countries. I mean, this has further compounded the difficult investment situation, pushing many multinational firms to postpone their investment plan. So it's not only the immediate effect, but also firms postponing what is the investment plan, and that is seen in the data that Rolando presented on divestment, for example, and diversion when you look into more detail. So in the case of Asia, the slump in demand, such as in industries like apparel and automotive, has led to factory closures and to scaling down operations when we look at the sectoral landscape. However, as we have seen, the increase in certain types of medical equipment and pharmaceutical products has encouraged investment expansion during this difficult period. Next, please. I mean, here we try to zoom in into the factors that include lockdown measures, supply chain disruption, and economic slowdown, and also to look at, as I said, to corporate earnings and vis-a-vis stagnant global demand. So I mean, I will not repeat all the data, but in 2019, already before the pandemic, we saw that FDI flows to the region already declined by 5%, despite gains in Southeast Asia, particularly in China and India. So already in 2019, we were going towards a declining trend, despite the giants, the performance in giants like China and India. Something very important to bear in mind is that within Asia, we have to analyze what is the prospect for structurally weak and vulnerable economies, such as the least developed countries in Asia Pacific. As we know, some LDCs are dependent on FDI in extractive industries. Many small island developing states in the Pacific are dependent on investment in tourism, and landlocked countries are disproportionately affected by supply chain blockage. So it's a very complex picture when you take into consideration the different levels of development in the region. And if we look beyond Asia to include the Pacific economies. So again, it's important to keep in mind the heterogeneous nature of the region when discussing policy measures going forward. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So basically, I mean, I will not go into all the complexities of our analytical chapter, but basically what we show is that the trends arrive at a boiling point. Basically, before COVID, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were challenges to the system of international production and global supply chain because of the differential impact of the new industrial revolution and Industry 4.0. Growing economic nationalism and sustainability imperative. So the pandemic arrives at a conjunction where we see important changes ahead in terms of the configuration of international production and what will be the future trajectory of these trends. Basically, as I said before, COVID-19 has highlighted the close interconnection between Asian economies. And this has led to this shock has led to multinationals to rethink their supply chains resilience. Some multinationals are diversifying or plan to relocate to other locations to build more resilient supply chain networks. So this will have an impact on FDI flows as well. But as we know, rebuilding supply chains takes time. It's not automatic. I mean, in addition to these trends, it's worth noting that relocation is further triggered by other factors, such as the existing trade tensions between the US and China. So that also has had an implication on the investment landscape and on the trade landscape in the region. As I said before, I mean, in this global complex picture, many countries in Asia have introduced investment measures, including further relaxation of equity ownership to support, promote, facilitate, and retain FDI. So perhaps, I'm sure the other panelists will discuss these investment measures, which also Rolando discussed. We have seen in our analysis that countries like China, for example, has relaxed more measures in response to COVID to attract FDI. So instead of increasing what is called investment restriction, there has been more relaxation, as well as other countries like Thailand and Malaysia. Next, please. Next. So I will not go into detail of this picture, but basically the message of our analytical chapter is that international production will follow what we call 4 different trajectories, not only due to pre-existing trends, but also now the pressing needs that arise because of the COVID shock. So basically these trajectories that we identified according to different industries, both in manufacturing, services, and primary in extractive industries, also agro-based, are reshoring, diversification, regionalization, and replication. I mean, chapter 4 of the report goes into detail of this analysis. I invite you to look at that. But I mean, in terms of Asia, we found that, and looking what has been the pre-existing record in terms of regional integration, we see that regionalization is one of the most likely trajectory for the region. I think I am exhausting my time. I'll not go into detail, but basically here what is important, a takeaway in this case is that regionalization will be important for the region. And in this context, regional economic cooperation, industrial policy, and investment promotion will become indispensable to rebuild or to reshape regional value chain. And also in this context, regional integration schemes such as RCEP become more important. Next, please. I mean, again, here we discuss, next slide, please. Next. Okay, thank you. So here we discuss the 4 trajectories and what will be the possible landscape for not only for production, but also for investment. And then finally, we try to tease out what are where do we move from and where we are going to, and what are the implications for developing countries. I mean, in general, we all know that the transformation of international production due to COVID and to pre-existing challenges bring both challenges and opportunities, not only for policymakers in Asia, but also for other developing regions. I mean, in terms of the challenges which have been discussed today, these include divestment, relocations of investment, and investment diversion. And more importantly, what we identified is a shrinking pool of efficiency-seeking investment, which implies a hardest competition, tougher competition for foreign direct investment between developing countries. But there are also opportunities. I mean, there are shadows, but there are also lights. In terms of opportunities, we see in terms of the transformation of international production, we see attracting investors looking to diversify supply bases and building redundancy and resilience. So in addition to regionalization, diversification will become an important driver of the movement of foreign direct investment in the region. I mean, confronting these challenges and capturing opportunities requires a change in investment development paradigm, and as we see in this table, and basically this means going back to industrial policy principles hand in hand with investment promotion and investment facilitation. As Rolando discussed, FDI can be further promoted, including through the greater use of investment promotion and facilitation, including incentives, electronic tools, and other strategies. But as I said, clarity and consistency is important in this context, especially because you need to react, investors need to react in real time to all these conditions. So in this context, the role of investment promotion agencies is very important in transmitting information about new measures and about new facilities available. I mean, as I said, I mean, regional cooperation in this context will be extremely important because now we will move to a context where FDI can help, I mean, to attract market-seeking and network investment. It's not only the all traditional drivers of FDI, but also the network investment and the regional investment attraction, including to those relating to building a more resilient supply chain. I mean, we know resilience is being coined in the development circles for decades, but now how to build this resilient supply chain to shocks is going to be a more complex task because of the interconnection between economies globally. I will stop here, but I'm happy to come back to more questions and discussions when the panelists are finished. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Amelia, for the useful information shared with us, and certainly the FDI is closely interlinked with the global production networks and the international trade. So the things like what you have discussed with us, the diversification of GVC, supply chain and reshoring, onshoring, nearshoring, the shortening of GVC will all affect the landscape of the investment flows into the region in the near term and in the longer term as well. That has been quite the informative presentation that we have enjoyed. Next, I'd like to ask our next speaker, Mr. Alma, from the Indonesian government side. We are particularly interested in listening to your views on how whether Indonesia is really feeling the pinch of this pandemic in the front of the Fdi flows, and if so, in which sectors, and how is the government is trying to cope with the current challenges. So with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Alma to give us some short remarks or presentation. The floor is yours.
Indonesia analysis of economy. This is on Indonesia's analysis of the economic response to COVID. Do you want to hear?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Alma.
Okay.
Hello?
Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay.
You are muted, Mr. Alma.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I also like to thank FDB for inviting the KPM and for arranging a special session on foreign direct investment at the time of COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, the world economy has been tested with the outbreak of COVID-19 early this year. It has disturbed the political, social, economic, and finance sector. According to OECD, in the first quarter of 2020, some of G20 countries experienced a slowdown. And as for Indonesia, despite the hardness of coping with the situation, we managed to grow at 2.9%, lower than projection. The slowing down was caused by restriction on economic activity and the efforts to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic in the various sectors such as trade, tourism, transportation, manufacturing, and industry. And however, according to several credible international institutions, we might bounce back from fallout in 2021 because our economic fundamentals continue to be strong and then economic outlook remains positive. Such projections boost our confidence to put all efforts to handling the economic recovery post COVID-19. I would like to share about our investment performance here. The first quarter of 2020, we managed to achieve about 210.7 trillion Indonesian rupiah, contributing 23.8% of the total investment realization target, and grew at 8%. For the first time this year, the domestic direct investment surpassed foreign direct investment by contributing about 112.7 trillion Indonesian rupiah, or about 53.5% from total value of quarter one investment realization. And so far, we are still on the track and optimistic about achieving the target. And this figure also shows that Indonesian economic resilience remains strong. Despite having strong economic outlook, our government has revised 2020 investment target from 886 billion Indonesian rupiah to 817 billion rupiah. And let's see. To maintain this momentum, BKPM has operated under 6 key performance indicators to boost investment performance. Among the 6, we are currently targeting the execution of large investment realization from 708 trillion investment realization potential in the pipelines. We managed to facilitate about 410 trillion in rupiah, and we believe that resolving investments, debottlenecking is one of effective strategy to attract inward investment. Specifically, to boost FDI during pandemic, BKPM continues to approach foreign investors who are interested to invest in Indonesia through a video conference. And we also continue to facilitate companies which have issues in licensing by directly coordinating with related ministers or government institutions. In executing the strategies, we conduct equal treatment, which applies to all countries. And as for the domestic direct investment, BKPM commits to support local business and small medium enterprises. We had signed MOU between the BKPM and the Ministry of State-owned Enterprises in the context of accelerating investment licensing and exchange data and information to increase investment realization and facilitate as a small state-owned enterprises companies. This MOU will provide a platform that create partnerships between local and foreign investors with small and medium enterprises. In addition, President's Presidential Instructions number 7 of 2019 was issued by government to give authorization for BKPM in terms of business licensing. This regulation enabled BKPM to provide a much faster licensing process. These presidential regulations allow BKPM to coordinate corrective measures to improve EODP's rating, evaluated the implementation of business licensing and investment facilities executed and provided by the Ministry of Institution. Also facilitate and provide service to investors in managing their business license and providing investment facilities, and prepare norms, standards, procedures, and criteria of business licensing and granting of investment facilities delegated by ministers of institutions. And all in all, BKPM is the front line in accelerating ease of doing business in Indonesia. I would like to reassure that BKPM is committed to always provide the best service to the investors through regulation reform and expediting licensing process, formation of incentive and assurance is giving investors protections and equal treatment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arma. Thank you very much for laying laying out the big picture of how Indonesian government is trying to keep the momentum of Fdi flows through various layers of the interministerial and the interinstitutional coordination measures and procedures. With that, I would like to ask our next speaker, Julian Chase. Professor Julian, given your expertise in international investment treaty areas, I would like to expect you to focus more on the investment treaties role in the current COVID-19 scenarios. You have the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, as a very brief transition, just want to introduce two legal elements which are important to understand my little presentation. The first are the so-called international investment agreements, which are basically bilateral or multilateral treaties that commit state parties to afford specific standards of conduct to foreign investors from the other state parties. So these treaties, in short, grant foreign investors certain benefits and rights. Now, in the world, we have a large number of investment agreements, more than 3,000, which includes important treaties such as the CPTPP, the ASEAN CIA, or more recently in North America, the USMCA. Now, in addition to these investment treaties, it's also very important to highlight the role of investor-state dispute settlements, or ISDS. In short, ISDS allows foreign investors, whether companies or individuals, to allege treaty violations by suing states through arbitration. That's the basic mechanism. Then tribunals may decide to grant compensation to foreign investors. And when they do so, tribunals, on average, grant to foreign investors compensation of around $300 million. So these disputes have been known for many years, but there's now a link that is obvious with COVID and the future of FDI in the region and the rest of the world. So that's the example I wanted to share with you. You see here the case of Peru in South America, which was publicly threatened in March, April by an investment claim. It's a case which I chose because it's well documented with public sources. But I just want to mention that there are many other rumors about other states that could be challenged by foreign investors. So I just take that as a very interesting case, well documented, which is going to show you what is very likely to happen in the coming months and years. So here, in very short, the story of Peru is quite simple. They have a first COVID wave in February, March, and Peru decided of a number of measures. One of them was that the government wanted all the highways to become free of access, and in order to favor transport, to facilitate transport of goods and people. So no need to explain that. Most of the companies agreed on that because they saw a good way to mitigate the consequence of the COVID in the country. However, a number of concessionaires, foreign companies, decided not to agree with this measure. So there are exactly 18 highways concessionaires, all foreign investors, that decided to charge tolls, which triggered further political reactions and tensions between the state of Peru and these foreign companies. And these are the 18 foreign companies that are now threatening Peru of filing a lawsuit. So that's very interesting because it shows you that what we call a COVID-19 measure, that means the type of regulatory responses that states have taken since the start of the pandemic, is in fact very broad. I was just talking about making highways free of charge. That's one of the many different types of measures taken by states all around the world, which is going to affect businesses and foreign investors. I've done a pretty large research with the idea to answer a very simple question, or I should say a very fundamental question. The fundamental question is whether Peru, like virtually all states in the world, could be challenged and lose a case, lose a dispute. And my answer is that it can happen, although it remains difficult today to assess the magnitude of these developments. In any case, threats of actual disputes, the threats or actual disputes illustrate the challenges that emerge from the crisis and show the complexity of the recovery. So I've conducted a survey of all COVID measures adopted by 50 states since December 31st, Taiwan being the first to take action. And this survey shows that things are complex because there is a great diversity and a great number of so-called COVID-19 measures. That means measures taken to tackle COVID, but that also have an impact, potential or actual, on foreign investments. What you see here is just a snapshot of the survey and the research. I've grouped these different measures in 4 big and broad categories, further divided in subcategories. So the main and big categories are measures that deal with foreign investors' operating conditions, then market access, transparency and fairness in global trade, 3, due process issues and irregularities, and 4, a number of other measures with indirect impact. So let me just take an example with, say, private property seizure that you see here. So private property seizure is something that can be observed in many jurisdictions. In Europe, states have requisitioned private supplies of masks, for instance, or other protective equipment for use in state-run hospitals. In China, the law allows the government to temporarily seize private hotels and hospitals to house patients. So these are all private property seizure, but applied to very different types of businesses and economic sectors. What's interesting for a lawyer is that the amount of compensation paid by European states, China, and many others in this context can vary quite a lot. In some instances, compensation is significant. In some of the instances, they are very low. And this is where there can be problems. Now, I just mentioned now the case of private property seizure, but as you can see here, there are many other types of measures which are problematic, such as price controls, export controls, compelling production, compelling supply. And what I just want to say in short is that all these measures taken by so many different states do have the potential to lead to some disputes that will be managed and decided by ISDS. So why are investment treaties relevant here? How to connect the dots, how to connect some of the measures I've mentioned and investment agreements? Well, in fact, ISDS depends on applicable investment treaties and more precisely on specific rights granted to foreign investors. And there are many such rights, such as protection against expropriation, national treatment, MFN, and so on. And each of these rights, you see a summary here, may provide a protection against states' measures taken as a response to the COVID crisis. Or let me rephrase, each of these rights can become a violation by states of their obligations under investment treaties. That shows you the potential for dispute and ISDS under these investment treaties. Let me conclude here with just a few more words with respect to the states' defenses. I'm not telling you that all the states in the world will face investment disputes. That's not so simple. There is a great potential, but the good news for states is that they can use what lawyers call defenses. And the defenses are classically provided in these treaties. So state can limit their exposure to SDS. In case of claims, in case of disputes, states can rely on some defenses to justify the COVID measures. But states will have to explain why they did something. They will have to justify their measures. Even if some COVID measures violate investment treaties, there's still a chance for governments to avoid paying compensation to foreign investors. Let me close in one sentence. The sheer number of COVID measures adopted by states over the last 6 months and the likely future measures, because the story is not over, all these measures form a very large group of acts, laws, that may have negative impact on foreign investors. And so there is a probability that foreign investors initiate legal proceedings now, or a little later, or much later. So that means that the recovery will be further complicated by the disputes and the tensions between states and investors. And as tribunals take usually between 2 to 5 years to decide on these disputes, it brings some of the pandemic consequences to the longer term, in fact. It means, at least from my point of view, that a number of proceedings or cases will last until 2023 or 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Julian, for sharing with us your views about. Actually, this is what usually are overlooked by many policymakers in the region and globally, because the government may just impose some kind of stringent measures under the pandemic to control and to contain the virus spread of the virus. But on the flip side of those measures could also entail some kind of litigation issues based on the ISDM, the investor state dispute measure mechanism, the clauses under the bilateral investment treaty. So this is a bit different angle of how we need to be cautious about the investment and FDI promotion related policies. So with that, I think that we also have got one more video slides from Maria, but given the
So as I mentioned earlier, we've already seen a very significant drop in FDI flows just in the first quarter of 2020, and we expect that to be true for the full first half of 2020. And in looking at the different components of FDI, we expect them to react somewhat differently. So reinvested earnings is becoming an increasingly important component of FDI flows, and we expect this to fall, and this is because first we expect the earnings of direct investment enterprises to fall. And so looking at some data from Refinitiv, which used to be called Thomson Reuters, where they actually gather information from a lot of analysts to see what they're expecting to happen from the firms they cover. They expect large year-over-year drops in earnings for a number of multinationals in the sectors that we talked about earlier, things like energy, the manufacturing, consumer discretionary. But they also expect earnings to increase in some sectors like healthcare, technology, and communications. But the other thing we think will happen is that the share that parents are choosing to reinvest in their affiliates is going to fall. And so if we look back at what happened between 2007 and 2008, there was a large drop in the share that companies were choosing to reinvest. And this could be because they continue to sort of pay out the same dividends from their affiliates as they always have. It could also be that you were moving money around within the company. Those entities needed more support. The next slide, please. So the other major component of FDI flows is equity capital. And here these are really tied to new investments, which can come either in the form of mergers and acquisitions or greenfield investments. And so looking first at mergers and acquisitions, we expect these to fall. So we know in just the top graph shows this, that there's a very close relationship between the value of completed cross-border mergers and acquisitions and equity capital flows. And what we see is a very big drop in the value of completed M&As in the first quarter of 2020. As a matter of fact, that chart goes all the way back to 2000, and the first quarter is the lowest value that we've seen. I think the somewhat, I guess, good news around this is that right now we're not seeing a lot of these deals being abandoned, but rather being put on hold. So there's been an increase in what are labeled as pending M&As. And so if the situation does improve, it's possible that a lot of those will actually be completed. Next slide, please. And so the other new investments come in the form of greenfield projects, and these are certainly more important in emerging and developing economies than they are in the developed economies. And what we saw looking at the first 3 months of 2020 is actually a big fall in the value of announced projects. So that means new things that are just getting underway. And a lot of this actually manufacturing showed up as being particularly hard hit. Now, this doesn't get to what may also be happening, which is some projects that were underway may be being put on hold for a while. But it does show, again, this drop in greenfield investment. And I should say, in those figures for the first quarter of 2020, the information that we have by components does show that that drop was mostly in equity capital flows, that reinvested earnings weren't really impacted too much in the first quarter. We expect most of that impact to come in the second quarter. Now, there's another thing that affects equity capital flows, and that's divestment. So that's when parents either choose to close or sell off affiliates. And these also impact FDI flows. In this case, they actually lower equity capital flows. We just did some research on these at the OECD, and we found that it's not actually been very well studied, but it's actually quite a common phenomenon. So about 1 in every 5 foreign affiliates is divested every 5 years. So M&Es are kind of always adjusting their portfolio of companies. One of the things we found to be very important drivers of divestments were the financial health and debt levels of the M&E as a whole. And so with the current crisis and the very high debt levels, that might indicate that there may be more divestments at this time, because it would be really hard for companies that are financially constrained to survive, quite frankly, the crisis, or at least to really support their affiliates. Looking back at the global financial crisis, we did actually see an increase in divestments in 2008. However, it was important to note that this was followed by a wave of acquisitions as firms were able to buy things at attractive prices. Next slide, please. And so looking at long-term impacts, and of course, this is all, very speculative at this point. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen with this crisis. But we do know that it's obviously going to affect different economies in different ways. We saw that with the sectoral breakdown. So economies where tourism is important or natural resources are important might be very impacted, depending on how integrated they are in global value chains and what's happening there. But as we said, there are some sectors where we might be expecting some growth, and these include things like healthcare and information technology and communication. So this might mean that there are opportunities for knowledge-seeking FDI. Given the collapse that we've seen in particular in the demand for energy, although that is recovering now, but even other commodities, that might not bode very well for resource-seeking FDI. And there's been a lot of speculation about what's going to happen with global value chains. So a lot of people are predicting that the disruptions due to the coronavirus might lead some M&Es to really try to shorten their global value chain bring the production closer to home so that it's less likely to be disrupted. However, there's also some people who are arguing, well, actually being more diversified geographically will actually help you survive location-specific impacts. And so that could actually be what happens. It's important to note that all of this is really adding to the other factors that were already making companies rethink their value chains. And in this were things like, the issues around trade, the demand for sort of productive and or more inclusive and sustainable production methods, and then of course digitalization. So this is just sort of one more thing that is adding to that rethinking. And even if there are lower levels of FDI going forward, it still means though that there will be opportunities and perhaps new opportunities in some of these sectors like communications or healthcare. However, it seems likely that offshoring is going to remain very attractive to many. And so there's just one more thing I wanted to add, which is that the international statistical community has actually just kicked off the process of updating all the guidelines and manuals for compiling macroeconomic statistics. And these include foreign direct investment. And so we're in that process now, and there are some additional information on FDI that we're thinking of including in the guidelines, and this includes things like greenfield investment or divestment. And so we're hoping that this additional information will be very useful for policymakers. So thank you for your time and attention.
I'd like to open the panel discussion straight, and then I'd like to add some questions to each and individual panelist, so we can have more interactive discussion before we close. First and foremost, I think that the FDI prospect, as mentioned by the IMF, UNCTAD, and by ourselves, all point to extremely bizarre the picture in 2020 and going forward. I mean, the 30 to 45% projected decline in the Fdi inflows into Asia for this year is quite a bleak picture. We might have been accustomed to many pessimistic estimation and forecasts in terms of the 20% expected decline in the remittances in globally, also the 60 to 80% projected decline in the tourism arrivals. But this number, 30 to 45%, is really stunning and alarming in a sense. So I think we need to think about how to navigate these serious challenges at the moment and going forward. With that, I'd like to ask my question first to Amelia. From your presentation, you have discussed the nexus between the changing landscape of the GVC and FDI inflows in the region. So you have also mentioned that there could be less efficiency-seeking FDIs because of the reshoring and onshoring motivation by many multinationals. But at the same time, we may, in the region, expect a growing amount of the market-seeking FDIs, which can also drive the deeper regionalization of the investment linkages. My question to you is that, but at the same time, Asia, given its young population, growing young population, and the fast-growing middle-income classes, Asia can offer quite attractive investment destination in terms of domestic demand and the market size. We can think about the cases like the Walmart's investment in the fully part of India and the Tesla's. The electricity car investment in China and the Facebook's and the Google's investment into India's Geo platform. So perhaps advanced countries could also have some interest in the markets in Asia from the perspective of the market-seeking incentives. So what do you think about this point?
No, I think it's very important, and I'm sorry I just had 6 minutes and I couldn't elaborate in the different trajectories. I think Asia is a region because of its richness and vast difference between what are more advanced developing countries and emerging developing countries in the region, that you see that have across the 4 trajectories that we identified opportunities among all of them. I mean, some developing regions might see more regionalization or more reshoring, but in Asia, because of what you described, because of the diversification, because the early advancement in terms of industrial revolution, you see prospects, despite the trends that we have observed in investment, for more investment. For example, in the case of regionalization, we moved from a world where specifically we used to think about efficiency-seeking investment and competition for markets. But now we see more segments opening in the GVCs to broader institutional and industrial clusters. So you mentioned the new emerging sectors in terms of electronic commerce, or the new landscape in terms of the automotive industry and the new opportunities. So these new broader industrial clusters provide opportunities going forward for a recovery of investment in GVCs. In terms of diversification, again, and this is related to what you mentioned, I mean, it's not only in electronics or in these new sustainability-led sectors, but also moving the shift from intangibles to service-based GVCs. And this is an area where Asia also has an advantage in comparison to other countries. And quality of hard and soft digital infrastructure is driving and will continue driving diversification in not only in the electronic sector, but also in more knowledge-intensive sectors like pharmaceuticals and more R&D intensive sectors. So if you look at across the four trajectories that we identified, Asia has the opportunity to attract more investment and to what we call move up the value chain in this, as we see the shrinking of investment, the pool of investment shrinking everywhere else. Another advantage of Asia is that in comparison to other developing regions, we have not seen a need to cope with premature deindustrialization. On the contrary, so this is another advantage for the region. So the shocks coming from restructuring, and as we discussed before, including divestment, relocation, and so on, might not affect Asia as much as the other because of the advancement already experienced in terms of the new industrial revolution and Industry 4.0. So basically, to make the story short, we have a broader industrial base. We have possibilities to upgrade within services and within high-tech R&D intensive sectors at the time that where investment is looking for more diversification and more regionalization and more replication of processes, because that's another advantage of the new industrial revolution. I mean, we see the greater need for cost efficiency in this new context with shrinking pool. And that's when also the investment policy and facilitation issue comes in as well. The need to support physical and digital infrastructure and quality of infrastructure, both hard and soft. So although the trends, and I mean, I didn't go into details into the region because the trends in East Asia might be different from the trends in South Asia. But in general, the conditions are there in terms of Industry 4.0, in terms of quality of infrastructure and quality of human capital, and so on, to have a sort of more positive prospect going forward, accompanied by the right type of policy measures that other panelists discuss. I mean, I'm happy to come back to some of the issues here.
Okay, thank you very much, Amelia. So your points about the importance of infrastructure and the human capital are quite the crucial factors which can affect the FDI prospect into the region in the near and the longer term future. So that having been said, I'd like to ask Mr. Alma, if you may, I think that your institution has implemented the variety of the incentive measures to attract more FDI inflows into Indonesia. And you have also briefly mentioned during your first round of intervention that how you are coordinating the licensing procedures to ease the business constraint for the foreign investor enterprises in your country. But there could be other types of incentives, such as tax incentives, finance incentives, the ease the procedure for the land acquisition and the business startup procedures, and the import duty drawbacks for the exporters residing inside the export processing zones, and among others. So among those various types of incentives, I mean, how your institution is assessing the effectiveness of those incentives for foreign direct investment, and how would you like to improve your incentives to sell the stronger points of the country toward the foreign investors in the future? Mr. Alma, please.
Yeah, thank you. Fiscal incentive is given to investors mainly to encourage investment in manufacturing sectors, as it is one of the sectors that contribute significantly to Indonesian development. There are several incentives here, like tax loans. Tax loans is a reduction in the net income by 30% of the total investment for 183 sectors, based on the government regulation. And then the others is tax holiday. Tax holiday, another incentive, there is two kind of incentive that inside in tax holiday. There's an income tax cut 100% for 18 eligible business fields, and income tax cut for 50% for 18 eligible business fields. This is for minimum investments of about 100 million Indonesian rupiah, or in dollars about 6.97 million US dollars. Is the minimum for to get income tax cut 50%. Another facility, a fiscal incentive, there is a super deductible tax policy. There are two kinds of super deductible tax policy, up to 200% tax relief for industry that invest in vocational education, and up to 300% for those involved with the research and development activities in order to create innovation. And other incentive is a provision of a net income production facility for new investment or business expansion in certain business field, which are labor-intensive industries. Net income will be deductible by 60% of the local investment in the form of the tangible fixed asset, including land. And the last one is import duty exemptions for capital goods, machinery, machine, and import goods for raw material. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Arma. Listening to your explanation, still perhaps the tax incentives should be at the core, at the epicenter of the incentive scheme for the foreign investment. I think that there could be some kind of further discussion how much those kind of incentives could be effective going forward. So let me now move on to my question to Professor Julian. Based on your presentation, I think that there could be potential risks of dispute between the foreign investors and the state government. So in your mind, do foreign investors have upper hand in terms of ISDM dispute and litigation cases, or what the past experience tells us on this front?
Well, I think looking back, there are some interesting disputes. I'm thinking about these disputes involving already public health or health policy. And a country like Australia, for instance, was challenged by a company called Philip Morris when Australia decided to impose some plain packaging requirements on the sales of cigarettes. The same for Uruguay in South America. So we have from the past a few examples that involve new and pretty radical change in health policy that affected negatively foreign investors, and they did not hesitate to challenge the host states, whether Australia or Uruguay. I think what's also relevant is to consider the fact that this COVID is a crisis. It's a sanitary crisis, but it's a crisis like many other economic crises. And here there is another line of disputes which are interesting. All the disputes that have involved Argentina or Greece over the last 10 years. The common point of these two countries is that they had to make some quick and radical adjustments as a result of the economic and social crisis. And many of these adjustments took the form of measures with new tax policies, with many different types of measures. And these measures, again, were challenged. What we have with the COVID is a combination. On the one hand, we get these health policy concerns and health policy measures, which are combined with this sense of emergency, this context, which leads states, governments to take some very radical measures. And so for the bit we can learn from the past, it's very predictable that there'll be some similar type of complaints, because there'll be companies that are going to lose a lot from this COVID.
Okay, thank you, Julian, thank you very much. That's one important point that policymakers in the region should keep in mind going forward. So this is something that we have not thought about very carefully, but this is something that we need to also keep in mind and take into account whenever we take necessary measures against foreign invested in enterprises in the region. So this is quite important point. So before I open the floor, let me ask one more question to Amelia. So as we've seen from the presentation by Rolando, the mergers and acquisitions, M&A is becoming an important mode of entry of multinationals into the Asian market, actually. But as I understand, there is still some resistance or pessimism in the region toward the M&A, which is in a sense understandable to a certain extent. We can think about some heavy-handed restructuring processes of the M&A, the firms, the laying off the huge numbers of the workers for the sake of the efficiency to turn around the business momentum, among others. So how should policymakers in the region view the M&As? Do they have a legitimate concern about this important mode of entry of the multinationals, or is this something that needs to be overcome?
I mean, as you rightly point, there are different entry modes of foreign direct investment, and as Rolando showed, the project component was very important in terms of the greenfield investment shock. Was like in the first quarter in 2020, we saw that greenfield dropped by 37%. But then when you look at the numbers of M&As in the region, also dropped by 35% on average compared to 2019. So both are have equal ground of concern, but the legal aspect of the M&As is more worrisome, as you rightly point. And then it comes to all the issues related to investment measures and the type of deals that have been done, especially in some specific industries. So if you look deeper into some regions in Southeast Asia, it was felt hardest. For example, we saw that the numbers of deals fell. So how investors maximize the quality and the number of these deals in the benefit of the local economy is an important question. And again, the issues that the colleague from Indonesia discussed are very important because it's a two-way avenue. I mean, some countries are hit negatively, but others benefit. So these type of deals, whether they are within what is legally permitted or what are the loopholes there is very important. Again, some countries benefit, but other, like in Southeast Asia, were hardly hit. So the question is how to look into these investment commitments bilaterally between countries, for example, let's say between Vietnam and Indonesia, or what are the type of deals that are being done that are driving this trend. So again, here the investors state relationships are very important, and the type of regulations in place, and those that are introduced as a sort of safeguard or others as a facilitation measure. There is sometimes a green line, a gray line there. So, but in addition to this, we also have to see the issues of, as I mentioned before, the investment plans and the projects, because that's another element that is also important going forward. But the legal dimension, yes, is very important, and especially in crisis, in times of crisis.
Okay, thank you, Amelia. Thank you very much. I think that you have raised a very important point in the sense that how we can make the FDI inflows win-win for both investors as well as the host economy. So, and through the various legal arrangements and incentives, among others. Okay, so with that, I'd like to open the floor for some questions and comments from the floor. If you have any questions or comments, you can write down yours into the chat box, or you can click on the icon for the hand, so we can collect some questions. Does anyone have any questions or comments? So otherwise, let me also ask one more question, because it's very good opportunity for us to listen to the policymakers' views and opinions from the region. So I'd like to ask one more question to Mr. Alma. So I understand your institution is not only supporting the foreign direct investment, also domestic investment. So in that sense, I think that the MSMEs, given its importance in terms of job creation and the contribution to the economic growth and others, I think I'm wondering how your institution is supporting the MSMEs, micro and the medium and small sized enterprises, to cope with the pandemic, and also help them have stronger industrial linkages with the foreign invested enterprises to maximize the benefits of FDIs. Mr. Alma, please.
Okay, the KPM commits to support local businessmen and small medium enterprises. We have, like I mentioned before, we have signed with MOU between the KPM and the Ministry of State-Owned Enterprises here, in the context of accelerating investments licensing and exchange data and information to increase investments realization and facilitate for small state-owned enterprises. This MOU will provide a platform to create partnerships between local and foreign investors with small medium enterprises, and which include in the BKPM key performance indicators to survive the pandemic, as well as to boost investment performance. And BKPM also to support medium small MSE by encourage large business in the business sector that are not required to partner with small medium enterprises. In the time that they have to have a partnership with them, with the small medium enterprises. And GKPM also encourage medium small enterprise to utilize technology, yeah, due to its advantage to reach broad markets, cut costs, and no business location required, and unlimited income potential. And the last one is the GKPM also has provide 50 hectares land for furniture industry. I think the companies from the small medium enterprises in one location in the Central Java. That's
okay. Thank you, Mr. Arnold. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I see Amelia has raised your hand to ask questions. Please go ahead.
No, I just wanted, to stress the issue of, in terms of M&As, your question of mergers and acquisition, what is a short-term temporary delay, and if and how this will translate into a longer-term shock. As we know, because of the pandemic, there has been temporary delays of approvals of deals and so on, but there are also political reasons and blockage behind this that we need to take into consideration, especially those measures introduced because national security considerations, and this is the work that Julian has been, allude to the work that Julian has been doing. So we have to be, as policymakers and as researchers, to try to, going forward, to see not only for M&As but also to greenfield what is a temporary blockage or delay, or whether this will become in longer term blockage of M&As because of political reasons and national security consideration. Like the same as I say for greenfield projects, which are also commitments, longer term commitments by firms overseas. So basically, there is an area where we don't tend to discuss much. We tend to focus on manufacturing M&As, is the financial markets. What is happening in terms of financial markets, where we have seen that prices have been down, and the stock of firms have been devalued and has been subject of many takeovers, and also have affected the functioning of the market. So I just wanted to make this point because it's important for the discussion, looking not only manufacturing but also financial markets, and looking what is a temporary delay or what is a political blockage of deals. And there are plenty of examples like Boeing, Deliveroo in the UK, or Amazon, where the acquisition of or deals have been blocked or delayed. I just wanted to make those points. Yes.
Yeah, it's Amelia. It's really valid point and important point at the same time, as you have rightly mentioned. Because of pandemic, many of the asset prices of local economies have plunged. So the bargain hunting incentives from the multinational could drive more of the M&A drive from their side. So how to balance this kind of the potential benefits from M&A and how to safeguard some key national stakes and key national interests at the same time. That's one crucial thing that the policymakers in the region need to think about it. So with that, I'd like to, because I don't see any questions from the floor, I'd like to ask each panelist to spare 1 minute exactly to share with us your recommendation for the policymakers in the region. What's the first and foremost priority should be in terms of the reinvigorating the FDI inflows into the region? Perhaps you can talk about for 1 minute each. Let me start with Julian first.
I'm sorry, I don't resist, but I see one question. Someone asking which countries are the most at risk of facing investors' lawsuits in Asia. If you don't mind, I can give a quick answer to that and follow up on the recommendations. To answer that good question, I would look at the states that have had more problems with ISDS and investors over the last 10 years. and that will be India, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, and a few others. So no one should take offense of being on that list. These are the facts. These are the usual suspects, I would say. They've had problems, they could have problems again. But of course, another very important parameter is the volume of investment. The more a country has FDI, the more likely there are risks, there are potential for disputes. Or conversely, the less a country welcome FDI, the less likely we are to see that country on the list of those facing problems. So here we could not include, but exclude countries like Japan, Bhutan. Bhutan, Japan will not have problems with ISDS. And there could be some other parameters, the diversity of sectors in which FDI are involved, because that makes the job of governments to handle the crisis and for investors even more difficult. If they only deal with one sector in which they have many foreign investors, that might be doable. But if they deal with 20, 30 very different economic sectors and a large volume of investors, the challenge for them in terms of transparency, predictability, fairness is very difficult. And I'm afraid it brings us back to the list of usual suspects. It's these countries which may be, well, the target of many measures. That was for the question. Just briefly to give some policy advice. In fact, we have mentioned the case of tax exemptions as being a tool for the recovery. I would say I want us to be very careful with that. That would be my only word as a lawyer, but for all the measures taken in the context of a crisis, or all the measures taken to recover as soon as possible, policymakers should make sure that these measures are explicitly linked to COVID, that they're explicitly for the short term, that they are not for the mid or the long term. Otherwise, some foreign investors may later on, in 2, 3, or 4 years, still expect the same tax exemptions or advantages. And this could again bring back to the case, to the scenario of disputes. So whatever is done is very important to, in the law, in the measures, to make clear it is to address the COVID, and it's only for a short period of time. That's it.
Thanks, Julian. Actually, the Microsoft team has some problems. I cannot open the chat box at all. So my MS team in my computer.
There is another question. I can read it, Jung-woo, if you want. I think Jung-woo we lost him, so I will just take over while he reconnects. We have another question from one of our guests on how is a race to the bottom with respective to incentives prevented? So how can we prevent this type of war of incentives between countries, which is one of the issues that has been raised about competition, even when we see all this offshoring, increasing competition for countries to continue or to promote more and more incentives to keep the FDI investments. So how can this be prevented, this type of race to the bottom? Perhaps, Amelia, maybe you have some.
Okay, Rolando, I'm back. I think my internet connection was down. So where were we? So perhaps I couldn't open the chat box, but I think we got some questions, right?
Yes. So we had one question on incentives of how is race to the bottom with respect to incentives prevented. So how can we prevent this type of behavior where more and more incentives are introduced and there is a competition basically for attracting FDI through more and more incentives?
Yeah, that's a very valid question. Perhaps we can ask Amelia first to respond to that question.
And I mean, some of these issues are not new. I mean, if we look back into the 90s, where the boom of FDI looking for markets in developing countries started, I mean, the competition in terms of national incentive policies across different countries was one of the key drivers of foreign direct investment. Now we have a more complex landscape because we have more standards, and we have more standards in terms of environmental standards, in terms of multilateral standards, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, what we try to do is to think about how investment development policy coherent can help to address all these issues, especially in a context where the whole production system of countries and nations and regions have to be rethought. So basically, this requires a sort of investment development paradigm that also includes industrial trade and all aspects of national and international policy measures. For countries, the way that we see it is basically, I mean, as the old paradigm, trying to move from an export exclusive investment focus to an investment focus that will include regional markets and broader industrial-based development. I mean, this anchor of FDI going into specific segments of export platforms might be also nurture grounds for further competition. So this is what we said, moving from export focus to export plus, where you have a more sort of regional cooperation and broader industrial base. The other issue is to move from cost-based competition for single location investor to competition for diversified investment based on flexibility and resilience. So again, here we need more type of regional cooperation in terms of policy making and embedding this not only in a bilateral investment agreement, but in broader free trade agreements like the comprehensive agreements in Asia. And also, I mean, one issue is the big versus small. I mean, we tend as developing the practitioners and researchers and policymakers to sort of benefit or prioritize large-scale industrial investors with big infrastructure. But we need to make room for small-scale manufacturing facilities and services with lean infrastructure in this context. So it's policy coherence at the national and regional level, but also new type of development that includes new type of industrial policy and a broader export focus, not just on enclaves with a large industrial project favoring a specific type of FDI. But that doesn't take away the investors' nationwide relations. There are many issues there that lawyers are more are better placed to discuss. Yeah. So basically, new development investment policy, looking at investment chain and broader opportunities for industrial development. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Amelia. I would like to take it as your intervention for the policy recommendation for the last round,
yes,
and
yes.
because we have running out of time. So perhaps I also would like to strongly agree with you that the importance of regional cooperation, because usually the neighboring countries are the main competitors in terms of trying to attract FDIs. How to prevent the race to the bottom among the neighboring countries could be quite important through the regional cooperation. So, Mr. Alma, would you have any last word for very briefly? You are muted. Please unmute.
Okay, I'm sorry. Actually, we are here in the pandemic, conflict, COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, that's very difficult time for us. Yeah, and I see that the small medium enterprises is very difficult time for them. They get the bad impact from the COVID-19. I think, but all the people, young people, millennials, most of them work in the small medium enterprises. So we have to help them. We have to create what kind of specific investment that they can join with this new investment. Yeah, and I think that's a government task to help them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Alma.
We have to get them with the state-owned enterprises. Yeah, because
yeah, certainly.
Support from the big company. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we are coming to the end of this webinar. I think there is no doubt that we are going through extremely turbulent period and challenging times, which is unprecedented, unparalleled, or even unconceivable to a large extent. I think the current situation now calls for policymakers' renewed attention to engage in the more proactive measures to reinvigorate the momentum for the FDI flows in the region. In that sense, I think that today's discussion has been very beneficial to all of us in thinking through the possible and appropriate ways to navigate the current challenges and under the fast-changing the international production, trade, and investment landscape. So I'd like to thank all 4 speakers, including the Rolando and also the Maria, who has joined us through the pre-recorded video clip, and for joining us as well as sharing their views and insights. And I really appreciate your time and extra efforts. And I also should mention our special thanks to Rolando for taking the lead in organizing this event. And
thank you very much to all of you.
I also would like to thank the Maria and the Carol for the extending tremendous amount of support to make this happen under quite challenging circumstances. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.